On March 26, 2020, Ohio State University Extension Ag and Natural Resources educator Lee Beers hosted a webinar presentation focused on making baleage as a stored forage production option. Considering the spring weather challenges experienced over the past couple of years, Ohio's forage producers are frequently looking for options that allow a more timely harvest of high-quality forages, especially when it comes to first cutting. Rory Lewandowski, OSU Ag and Natural Resources educator in Wayne County, was the featured presenter during that webinar. This is the advice Rory offered in regard to properly making and storing baleage.
We're going to talk about baleage as a stored forage production option this afternoon, run through some of the aspects of that. So I do have to acknowledge some of the information on this presentation and some of those sources. So certainly a lot of work, good work has been done on baleage out of the University of Wisconsin with Kevin Shinners in particular, Dale Undersander, their emeritus forage specialist. Then the USDA Dairy Forage Research Center located in Wisconsin, Wayne Koblenz in particular, some of his work. Jimmy Henning was up at the Ohio Forage and Grassland Conference probably about a month and a half ago, and some of the work he did from in University of Kentucky and some of the work they're doing with baleage is in this presentation. And then work out of Penn State by Marvin Hall and Jessica Williamson, and then from the Ohio State University, Bill Weiss. So I do want to thank those folks for their input and certainly for some of the information that I've learned from them. So when we look at baleage, it's kind of a hybrid system between a silage system and a dried hay system. It does combine baling with ensiling, and what makes this work is it allows you to take forage and use your baler, and you're baling at a higher moisture content than what we would call dry hay, and then wrapping it in plastic, and those are important components. Our goal with this system is to produce a really high quality, highly palatable fermented forage. And so because it's fermented, that means that there's going to be certain conditions that have to get met. Most typically, we see this used with either large round bales, or we see this happening also with large rectangular bales, particularly up here in Wayne County with some of our commercial hay producers. And that system works well for those commercial producers because they stack a little bit better and for hauling if they're going to be hauling them any kind of distance. So it can be worked with either of those systems. Why do we consider baleage? It does have some advantages certainly over a dry hay system, mainly from the standpoint of minimizing weather disruptions. And by that, we're primarily talking about, of course, rain disruptions. So in spring of the year, early in the season, although the last couple of years, certainly it seems like throughout the growing season, but whenever we get those rain patterns that don't allow for good times of drying, baleage is a good option because we get it put up a little bit sooner, so we can cut a little bit earlier and then bale sooner after mowing. That's an advantage. Because of the fact that we are typically baling at a higher moisture content, we just simply typically get less leaf loss, so less leaf shatter, especially in some of those operations like raking, tedding, and or baling. And so because we get less leaf loss, that obviously helps to improve our forage quality. In addition, because we are baling it up at a higher moisture content, then wrapping in plastic and going into an anaerobic condition, we cut down on some of those respiration losses. So we keep more of the plant sugars and get a higher quality product as a result. We also get increased palatability. Typically, that's a characteristic of a lot of our fermented forages. Our livestock do like it, especially as we get into, we look at moving into a more mature forest. We don't have quite the stemminess, so again, palatability helps, so we get less feeding loss that way. And then when we're thinking about a storage system, reduced outdoor storage loss, certainly, especially if we're talking about some of our round bale systems where we're storing hay outside. We know that those losses, depending upon the storage conditions, can be anywhere from 10 to 30% or even higher in some cases. With a wrapped bale or a baleage system, because it is, again, is wrapped in plastic, as long as you're maintaining the integrity of that plastic, you should really have very minimal to no storage losses. The losses really start coming about as we get into feed out, and we'll talk about that. And then finally, certainly when we compare it to just a silage system, baleage, again, because it's a hybrid between, is less expensive than a chop silage system. We don't have the expensive choppers that are used in a silage system, some of the silo structures, maybe some of the packing tractors that are needed. We essentially are using the same equipment as we use in a dry hay system. So our balers, rakes, and tedders, we'll talk about there are maybe some modifications that we may have to make to some balers, but essentially, again, we're using a lot of the same equipment and don't have to get a different line of equipment to make this system work. There are some reasons, though, why people are a little bit reluctant to use baleage, and some of the work that was done at the University of Kentucky and the Baleage project that they had there, they surveyed a number of their producers in Kentucky, and they found that really one of the #1 reasons that people were a little bit reluctant to move to baleage was this risk of botulism and or listeriosis. And that is certainly is a concern, is a risk factor. We'll talk about some things you can do to recognize when that risk is high and how to minimize that risk. Other reasons, moisture content is really a key to making good baleage. So that the challenge is, how do you determine the correct moisture content and really do it at the right time and get a timeliness to it. So that can be a disadvantage if you can't judge that moisture content, or you can't test it and can't get a good feel for that. Handling and disposal of plastic, for some people, this is a very real and significant concern. We do not, at the current time, really have any good system in place to recycle that plastic. I know a few years ago here in Wayne County, we did have a system in place, but that business is no longer functioning. And so what happens with all this plastic? A lot of farmers, it's a nice system, but a lot of that plastic is getting burnt, or it's going to a landfill, or it's getting buried. And so, disposal of it is a factor to consider. Then you've got to handle it, and you've got to get the bales wrapped. So that is another piece of equipment. Do you buy that wrapper? Do you rent it? Do you have somebody come in and do some custom work with that? Probably depends on how much of this you're doing, and if this is going to be a kind of a more long-term part of your operation. And then the weight, because we are dealing with higher moisture bales, we have to consider that we're handling more weight. We've got a lot of water weight there. So do you have the equipment to be able to handle that additional weight? There are some feeding modifications that have to be made with using a fermented product as baleage. So we have to be able to manage feed out. We have to think about what's our rate of feed out, what amount are we putting out there, and kind of manage our bunk and feed out system. So there is a learning curve involved with that. When we talk about baleage, I think this is a key. We have to understand that fermentation process, and that's the key right there. It's a process. So this slide here is a chart, and it looks at kind of the biology of fermentation. And when we talk about fermentation, we're really looking at different phases that our forage has to go through to get from that fresh product into a stable product. And so what I want to do, and really with this presentation on baleage, is provide some of the whys behind what's happening, so you understand what's happening and where things can go wrong and why they can go wrong, or why things go right. So when we look at this chart, we see that we start off here, and let's see if I can get I don't know if I can get a pen, but maybe, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but basically we've got, when we start off with forage at a fresh stage, we've got 3 different color lines here. We've got a green line that indicates the pH. We've got kind of this brown line that indicates the temperature of our forage, and then we've got a curved line here that starts off with our aerobic bacteria and goes to anaerobic. And our goal really in a fermentation process is we can think of it a little bit as a battle, really. So when we start off with a fresh forage, we have the potential to have desirable microorganisms and undesirable. And what we want to do in the fermentation process is get it into an anaerobic state. We want to basically kill off or render dormant those bacteria that are undesirable. So those bacteria that can cause mold and spoilage. So we're looking at both bacteria and yeast. And we want to make sure that our anaerobic bacteria have an advantage so they can take the sugars in the plant, convert that into acids, and drive the pH down. So our goal, when we look at this brown line, that peak up there, that's our temperature with after we cut a forage, temperature is going to spike, of course. We want to make sure we drive that temperature down so it doesn't get too high. Try to avoid a Maillard reaction. We'll talk more about that. Our pH here, then, we want to make sure that we drive that down and get to a stable product. And the key to making this happen is right at the beginning here, this aerobic phase. We want that aerobic phase to be as short as possible so that we do not burn up all our plant sugars, but we have them available for our anaerobic bacteria to use and convert into acids to drive down the pH, keep our temperature down to avoid spoilage, and end up with a stable product. And so you can see kind of the time phase there. So we're looking at, at a minimum typically of at least 14 days, and then to get a really stable product longer than that, probably over a month. So the characteristics then of a good fermentation, if we want to summarize that chart, are, again, we have a short aerobic phase to really minimize the loss of plant sugars. Those plant sugars, we want them to be available for our anaerobic, our desirable bacteria to use and convert them into acids. In particular, lactic acid is what we'll talk about. We want that conversion then to the lactic and acetic acid, and by far, again, the strongest acid in this suite of acids that we can have develop is lactic acid. That's going to be responsible for dropping the pH. And ideally, we would like this pH drop to be as quick as possible. So we want to produce a lot of lactic acid, drop that pH, and again, render inactive all the undesirable microorganisms and make sure we get to a stable, healthy product. In doing so, we want to make sure that, again, temperature during that fermentation doesn't exceed 120. And that temperature is going to be driven by both the moisture and by the amount of air. So if we've got high moisture and good air conditions, temperature is going to go up. We essentially are going to be in a little bit almost like a composting situation, and we can drive that temperature up. Whenever we get into that 120 range, we think about a Maillard reaction, which is basically a caramelization reaction that will take some of our crude protein, convert it into a non-available, bind those proteins up, and even though the animals may like that product, it's kind of a desirable, we're not going to get animal performance. We want to keep that temperature below 120. Again, a good fermentation, it should smell pleasant. It should smell like a typical silage product, and should have relatively good bunk life when we feed it out without seeing a lot of spoilage. We do have to recognize that in this fermentation process that there's a difference in the different plant materials, different forages that we might use. There is a pretty significant difference between legumes and grasses. In particular, we look at here the production of lactic acid that's required to drive that pH down. Again, that's the reaction that we want to dominate in a fermentation process. We want our anaerobic bacteria to utilize the plant sugars, produce lactic acid, drive the pH down rapidly. When we do that, we get that desirable bacterial population. We render inactive or dormant the undesirable bacteria, and now we have a product that's going to be of good quality. That lactic acid production and the resulting endpoint of pH, how low we get on the pH, is really dependent upon the level of plant sugars that plant material has in it to begin with. And part of that is dependent upon the species of plant, legumes versus grasses, and the maturity of the plant. Legumes in particular do have a lower sugar content than grasses, and then the other factor kind of working against legumes in an ensiled system is that they have a high buffer capacity, so they resist pH changes. So we actually need a higher sugar content in legumes to drive that pH down. And so for any given sugar content in a legume versus a grass, we're going to get a smaller pH change in a legume as compared to a grass. So grasses work better in most of our silage systems. So in order to make legumes work, we have to, again, do things right. We have less room for error in that type of system. And then recognize, again, moisture content, again, is just a key factor. I can hardly stress that enough. Moisture content in silane is really important to making high quality legume silage. It's one of our really driving factors to determine quality. If I'm not in the right moisture range, nothing else I do is going to matter that much, because I really limit it, the quality of product that I can end up with. This chart basically shows you, kind of emphasizes some of that. So it's plant sugar concentration required for good fermentation, and it basically spells out the minimum initial sugar requirement. Alfalfa could be any other legume, but representing legumes, we've got a grass and we've got corn for corn silage. But if you look at here, we talk about baleage as kind of our goal. We want to make it at a 50% dry matter would be a goal. There's a range in there, but you can see that we require at least a 6% minimum sugar requirement. And if you look down here below that, alfalfa can range from 4 to 15. So we don't have a lot of wiggle room to go at a dry moisture content much above that, or we're not going to certainly have enough sugar content to drive it. As we get into a little bit wetter forage, that can work. But again, for baleage, we can't get too wet because we run into other issues. So we've got a narrow range in here where it works. Once we get into grasses, though, you see that we've got a lot more wiggle room to be able to make a successful forage, just from the standpoint of sugars that are available and having enough there to drive that pH down. So grasses are certainly a more forgiving type of forage product if we want to put it in siled or baleage type of system. Other factors that affect baleage quality. Certainly maturity. So we're going to go through a couple of factors here, but maturity, we can't improve forage quality by fermentation. We can affect palatability to some extent, but we're never going to have better quality than whatever that quality was the day we mowed the forage. We can only go downhill from there. We cannot improve it. So if you want a high quality forage, depending on the class of livestock you're going to feed it to, you really have to match up your mowing time with the stage of maturity of that plant. This is a chart that many of us are familiar with, working with forages or working with pasture systems. We throw this up. This should be familiar. And basically what it shows that for both legumes and grasses, as that plant matures along that bottom axis there, quality decreases, and decreasing quality is represented by an increasing percentage of stems as compared to leaves. So our leaf stem ratio goes down. Fiber content increases, and because that increases, crude protein then on a percentage basis, and I could put in plant starches and sugars, the same thing, are going to decrease. So the point here is that as forage gets more mature, yes, we increase yield and tonnage, but the quality goes down. So we have to try to, again, match this up. And as fiber content increases, it is more difficult to get good fermentation, make higher quality silage. There's a couple of reasons for that, but one of those just is it's stemmier material, and as we go up in maturity, we have less plant sugars available. So again, sugars helps to drive that process. And because it's stemmier, it's harder to get a good dense pack, exclude the air, and get into that good anaerobic system that we desire. Moisture, I've mentioned that a couple times, but again, moisture is absolutely critical to get a good baleage product. We have to be able to moisture content that promotes good fermentation, and the goal again would be 50%. So obviously, depending on what kind of acreage you're doing, you're probably going to start a little bit higher than that, and you may end up a little bit lower than that. But we have a desirable range in here, 45 to 60%. Again, the goal would be midpoint at that 50%. If we get too wet, we get into this top line here. What's sometimes termed a sour fermentation. Basically what we're going to do, it could be a clostridial type of fermentation, which increases the risk of botulism. Doesn't necessarily mean it is going to have a botulism type of situation, but increases the risk that it could be. We get a higher butyric acid content produced rather than lactic acid, and it's not desirable from a livestock standpoint, palatability, smell, those types of things. Then you can see we've got a range here where we get pretty good fermentation. Then we get drier. Certainly we have baleage that's happening at some of these moisture contents, but as we get drier, we have to add more wraps of plastic to really make sure we're excluding the air, keeping a good anaerobic environment. And really what we're doing at this point, we're getting limited fermentation, and what we're really doing is preserving the forage, not fermenting the forage. So kind of a slight difference, and we'll touch on that as we go through the presentation. It's important to understand what happens with a plant and how it loses moisture and how rapidly it loses moisture as we look at our hay production systems. And again, this applies whether it's dry hay, baleage, or a silage. But typically, after that plant is cut, it's going to continue to respire. So you could think of it almost like, the plant is dead but doesn't know it yet. So it will continue to respire, burn up those plant sugars, which again, from a plant quality standpoint, what our animals need for performance and what we need for good in silage, we need those plant sugars to remain. So respiration burns those up, and that continues at a fairly rapid rate until we really get down to about 60% plant moisture. Now, it does flatten out after that, but it still continues, even probably all the way down to somewhere in that 25–30% range where we're still going to have respiration. But it's especially critical to dry down to at least 60%. That's our highest point on the curve where we really lose a lot of sugars. So we want to get that down, moisture to 60%. And so that's why we talk about, kind of our baleage somewhere in that between 50 to 60% is where we're going to start trying to make our baleage. This is some work that was done out of Penn State. And they found that if producers are doing a pretty good job at cutting at the right maturity stage, and they've also are beginning to bale at the right moisture content, the next really crucial factor in getting a good quality baleage is how dense is that bale able to be made. And the denser that bale is, the better baleage product we're going to get at the other end. And that's really just simply a result of excluding that air. So what we're doing is we're shutting down. You remember that back to that initial curve I showed you, that aerobic phase. We're cutting that down to very short because we're excluding oxygen. We're letting the plants use up the oxygen very quickly, and we get into that anaerobic phase quicker. So now our desirable bacteria are able to start taking those plant sugars. We have more plant sugars available, and they can use them to make a better quality product. So bale density is really important. So you think about what do you need to do to get a denser bale. Oftentimes that means slowing our tractor speed down, maybe kicking our RPM, our PTO speed up to get a denser bale. Some balers are better at this than others, but again, Penn State work shows that is an important factor. Bale density will also have an impact on bunk life. So as we get into feed out, we see that once again, bale density really helps to promote that feed out, so we can keep that bale out there a little bit longer before spoilage. So once we open up a bale, and you're gonna hear this a number of times, but oxygen or air really is the enemy of any kind of ensiled forage. And so once we open up that bale that's been preserved, that baleage or silage, we get oxygen exposed. Now some of those organisms that undesirable that maybe have been dormant, in particular some of the yeast, are going to become more active, and they're going to start generating molds and spoilage organisms, and so that affects bunk life. But again, that bale density really can help to increase bunk life. So that's another important consideration when we're looking at factors on producing good baleage. And then, of course, a big key is wrapping those bales as soon after baling with enough layers of plastic. This is work done out of the University of Wisconsin. What they did, they looked at bales made at kind of on the upper end of where we'd like to see, obviously, baleage made about 63% moisture. Again, our goal would be about 50%. And then they looked at on the drier end. So the kind of two different extremes. But at this wet end, you can see here again this kind of purple-violet line up here. With no wrap, you see that temperature really spike up there, way above that 120. So we're getting, into areas here where we have extreme heating of forage, damage to the proteins in the forage. which we would expect again with high moisture and oxygen. As they wrap it, that temperature begins to come down. And so I want you to look at the two lines here, the bottom line, this red line that says 0 hours, and the yellow line that says 24 hours. And basically what it shows you that if it was forages wrapped within 24 hours, they were able to kind of prevent it from exceeding that 120 threshold. But forages here wrapped very soon after baling, so within hours after baling, really had the lowest temperature. So the take-home message here is, again, to wrap as soon as possible, no more than 24 hours. And we saw the same type of thing. So these were drier bales at about 36% moisture. So really on the dry end of things, and the same type of thing. But once again, if we wrapped within 24 hours, and the sooner we wrap, the better. The closer to baling, after baling, we were able to wrap, the better we were able to control that temperature and maintain quality. And so remember, when that temperature is going up, it also indicates high respiration rates. We're burning up plant sugar. So again, we want to keep temperature low and keep those respiration rates low, save those sugars for our bacteria to convert them into our acids that bring the pH down and provide a better quality product for our livestock. So timing on that, again, soon as possible after baling. The goal, again, is to reduce that aerobic phase of fermentation. We want to minimize our sugar and carbohydrate respiration losses, keep that bale temperature lower. So typically, because again, this is a biological system, we are going to see different responses dependent upon ambient temperature. So in the summer, biology is going to work faster. So those respiration of the bacteria in the bales before it's wrapped is going to occur sooner. It's going to occur faster. We will get higher losses in the summer as compared to maybe wrapping these bales in a cool fall condition. So in the summer, we want to wrap ideally sooner. So it'd be great if we could wrap those within 2 to 4 hours after baling. On a cool fall day, maybe within 8 to 12 hours. But as soon as possible will definitely help. If we delay our wrapping, it's going to prevent adequate fermentation or maybe reduce the endpoint of our fermentation, and that will be reflected in higher baleage pH. How much wrap should we put on? There's pretty definitive research out there that shows we need probably at least 6 or more wraps of 1 mil plastic. Again, this is some work from University of Wisconsin, Kevin Schinner's work. And we look at that, again, with no wrap, we get this big spike. But as we increase our wraps, again, keeping that temperature low and getting a stable product. So typically we think of at least 6 wraps. When we do that, it really establishes a good environment for baleage because it's eliminating air. So those wraps are essential to locking the air out so that it can't penetrate and get into the bale, allows any air that is in the bale to get used up without more air coming in, so prevents that heating and allows us to get into that, again, that anaerobic phase of fermentation sooner. Minimum, again, of 6 layers, 1 mil plastic. Now, that's kind of a minimum. As we get into other conditions, we may need to add more. If we are baling a drier product, so we're getting more limited fermentation, we want to add more layers of plastic. I know that we have commercial hay producers here in Wayne County, for example, that are wrapping some of our wrapping hay at anywhere from probably 30 to 40% moisture. So, with that, they need to add more wraps, and some of those are adding up to 8 or 10 wraps of plastic in order to preserve that forage. As forage maturity increases, we need to add more wraps. Now, part of that, again, is because as it increases, we have lower sugar content. So again, that's going to limit the amount of fermentation we get. But part of it also is that as our maturity increases, we get these bigger stems. Stemmier materials can poke through plastic, so we need to add more wraps just to protect that, make sure that we maintain an anaerobic environment within that bale. There are some key differences between baleage and silage, and again, this is important to understand some of those differences and what that means. Baleage does take longer to ferment than in a silage system, and basically it's because we're not chopping the forage. We're baling those long stems, And when you think about what chopping does, it's going to release those sugars, so the bacteria have better access to those sugars, more complete access to the sugars, and so it allows it to go into a more complete fermentation. When we're in a bale system, we have those long stems, and so the bacteria don't have as much access to those sugars. It's not as easy to get at them, so we have a more incomplete fermentation. So typically our endpoint pH is going to end up higher than it would with silage. In addition, because we're using these stems, we can have more airspace, so it may not be packed as tightly as a chopped forage. That means that we're not doing as good a job of excluding that air. So again, not getting maybe quite as good fermentation with that. Or we have an extended respiration time. And our goal, again, is we want to have a short respiration time and have a very rapid drop in pH. With baleage, if we don't do a good job of packing that forage, of getting a nice dense bale, we extend that respiration time, and again, it shows up in a higher endpoint pH. Baleage typically, again, is made drier than chopped silage. So corn silage, we talk about a dry matter content of 35% is ideal. Again, baleage, we're talking about 50%. So just because it's drier, that in and of itself will have some restrictions on the fermentation process. So the goal here is really, the closer we get to mimicking some practices that result in a high quality chopped silage, the better our baleage product will be, but it's never going to go through the same amount of fermentation as a chopped product. And so there are some limitations there, and those are some things that we have to be aware of. So some cautions and red flags then because of that. This is our goal. We'd want a pH on that baleage to end up at 5.0 or lower. Now, just to compare, corn silage. Again, it's a grass, has higher sugar content. We chop it, so we can do a better job of packing. But most of our corn silage on the farm, we think about corn silage pH as certainly being below 4.5 as kind of a minimum, and most of our corn silages are going to be probably in that 3.8 to 4.2 range. So here we're starting baleage in 5.0 or lower. We want our lactic acid concentration to be 3% or higher. So we have kind of four main acids that we can see in these fermentation systems: lactic acid, acetic acid, propionic acid, and butyric acid. Butyric is definitely undesirable. Lactic acid is the strongest acid in there, and so we want to see that content be the largest and drive that pH down. But butyric acid is really an undesirable one. We want to see that at being at 0.1% or less. Now, if you get a butyric acid formula, you're going to know it. You're going to have that kind of rancid butter type of smell, very unpleasant. The other thing you'll see if baleage quality is not good, we can look at percent of the total nitrogen that's converted to ammonia. Typically, we like to see that less than 15%, probably less than 12 to 15%. And then the other key to a good quality baleage is our ash content, and we'll look at some factors influencing that. But less than 10% would be ideal, but certainly under 12% is probably acceptable. Now, the significance of all this, again, that if we meet these kind of standards, we typically end up with a stable forage, has good bunk life. We have a low probability of that clostridial toxin, which is related to botulism, and a lower probability of listeriosis being a concern. So botulism, I mentioned at the onset of our presentation that is a concern for many producers, wondering, how big a risk is this? And it certainly is with a fermented product. Botulism, it's a highly toxic disease caused by the ingestion of the toxin. It's produced by a Clostridium organism, Clostridium botulinum. The spores are just naturally occurring in soil, so we're not going to get away from this. Those spores, however, need certain conditions in order to multiply, and then it's those spores that actually produce a toxin. But they have to have anaerobic conditions, so no air, which of course is what our goal is in a fermentation with baleage. And here's the other key, though. They have to have a pH greater than 4.5. Now, our best indicators, if we are into a clostridial fermentation, are looking at that butyric acid content and then the percent of nitrogen that's been converted to ammonia, because those clostridial organisms will deanimate the forage protein and not allow it to go to a lactic acid. Now, it is important to note here, I've got down at the bottom of your notes there that Clostridial fermentation does not equal botulism. We can have Clostridial fermentation without botulism, however, if you do have Clostridial fermentation, it's a higher risk. There's a risk that you do have botulism, and of course, that's a fatal condition. We don't want to have our livestock encounter that. So what are our risk factors with Clostridial growth? Well, it's whenever we get high moisture content, so 70% or higher. So again, knowing the moisture content of that forage when you're going into a baleage system. Is it at the right content to begin your baling and wrapping? 70% or higher, we increase the risk of going into Clostridial fermentation. Anaerobic conditions, that's going to happen. That's our goal in baleage. But then poor fermentation. This is going to typically occur again with forages that have low soluble sugar contents, carbohydrate contents, or mature forages. And oftentimes with mature forages, it's a higher risk because that sugar content percentage-wise is going to decrease. And then, as I mentioned, with more mature forages, we have oftentimes a little more difficulty in getting a denser bale, getting a tight wrap, and so we don't get into anaerobic conditions. All those work together to get a slower pH drop, which again, our goal is to get a fast pH drop, and so we end up with then a higher pH as an endpoint. The other risk is if we get forage contamination by soil, which is reflected in the ash content of a forage analysis, or we get manure incorporated in there somehow, or a dead animal. So, sometimes maybe a woodchuck or a rabbit or something has died out in our forage field and it gets baled up in the forage. Those are conditions where, again, could be a higher risk of Clostridial growth. So soil in baleage, we use ash content as an indicator. And so again, I'll put in a plug here that we really like to see producers testing all their forages. So I think Ted Wiseman has been a big proponent of all our extension educators, should have a forage probe in their office, be willing to lend it out to our producers, and certainly encourage any forage producers to be testing their forages to know what they got. So ash content would be something we come back in a forage analysis. Our average internal ash content of most legumes and grasses in that 6 to 8% range. It's not uncommon just in the harvesting process, so raking, tedding, baling, to add another 3 to 4% from external sources. Again, primarily that's going to be soil and dust. And so total ash content on most of our analyzed stored forages are going to be in that probably maybe 9 to 12%. So we'd like to, again, certainly keep that ash content under 11%, 12%, something like that. If it gets over that, we know we've got extra soil in it. And again, it's just another risk factor for Clostridial fermentation or even possibly Listeriosis. So where do we get these high ash contents? Last couple of years have been prime examples of this. We get a lot of rain, rain splashing soils onto our forages, and then we need to get out there and get them mowed and made in a short window. Or last year we saw this quite a bit in some fields where we get flooding. So we'd have fields flooded, carrying soil farther up onto the plant parts. We saw that many of our corn silage fields as well, and so the ash content was increased soil contents, and again that increases some of our risk of Clostridial fermentation. Or aggressive raking. You see some people, the rake's set too low and they're out there kind of just scooping up soil into the hay, or in really dry, dusty conditions as well, with both raking and baling, getting a lot of dust and soil onto the forages. With Listeriosis, this is an encephalitis disease. It's caused by the bacterium Listeria monocytogenesis. It's found in soil, manure, rotting vegetation. Grows in cooler temperatures and, again, anaerobic conditions, so our fermentation products like baleage is at risk. But there's the key here, again, pH of 5.4 and above. And again, our goal would be to have that pH stay at 5 and below. But once our animals would ingest this, it again affects their cranial nerves, so that we get this kind of, it's sometimes called circling disease as well, listeriosis, and you can see the symptoms there. If you get early intervention, you have to catch it really quickly on there. Antibiotic therapy can be successful, and particularly with cattle. But the sheep and goat survival rate is only about 25%. So I know some of our sheep folks, this is one of the reasons they're a little bit shy sometimes about using baleage. But again, if you do a good job and recognize risk factors and minimize those risk factors, baleage can work very well with sheep and goats as well. So when we look at other risk factors, again, limited fermentation. So once again, we don't drop that pH low enough because of not getting good anaerobic conditions, or because we don't have good sugar contents in there. We get soil manure contamination, we get spoiled or moldy appearance. We'll talk a little bit about mold later on. Not all mold is necessarily bad, but it's a caution. Or we feed too much baleage at one time. And so again, because this is a fermented product, as soon as we open it up, again, oxygen or air is the enemy of good fermentation. Those yeast organisms are now available to start producing molds. And so if our baleage is out there and setting out too long, more than the animals can clean up within a good time period, we can get spoilage, and that can be a risk factor. So I threw in here a couple slides just as kind of summary slides from Bill Weiss, some of his potential issues with baleage. I think do a good job of summarizing this section. So cautions, again, flags, issues with baleage from Bill. He'd say anytime you see surface mold, just recognize that, maybe that has something to say. Certainly can decrease palatability. Listeria, again, it's not unique to baleage, but is a situation where it can occur. So bacteria found in high pH silage. So that's our key here. We'd really like to have low pH. Our risk increases as the pH gets above 5. So if you're going to be using baleage very much as a production system, maybe investing in a cheap pH meter, is something that you want to do so you can test it, because again, it's one indicator of quality. And then there's that botulism we've talked a bit about. Now, some of our forages maybe tend to be a little bit higher risk for botulism. Bill mentions some things here, some of our small grain baleage, oftentimes because we tend to make that maybe a little more mature stage. We're getting into the reproductive stage of growth, so stemmier material. Sometimes it's also made of a little bit wetter content, so we've got a wetter content, a more mature forage, so our sugar content's down low, and when you put all that together, you get, again, the high pH and high moisture, and you can get the clostridial fermentation. So he gives an example there, a 27% dry matter oat leach with a pH of 5.5. That, if you saw that condition, definitely should be a red flag that you would not want to feed this material unless you're, maybe prepared to lose some livestock. So when we evaluate baleage quality, one of the tools we have out there is a fermentation analysis. Now, this does not have anything to do with quality. It's not a quality analysis. This is just really helping us evaluate what happened during the fermentation process, but it's a tool. So this is from the University of Kentucky, their Baleage project that they did. This was some work that Jimmy Henning presented at the Ohio Forage and Grassland Conference this past year. And you can see there, if you're looking in those red bars, lactic acid percentage, this is a summer annual. The goal is to have greater than 3% lactic acid. This particular forage had about 3.8. Butyric acid, we said we want to be less than 1.1%. This had 0. pH is sampled. We want it to be under 5, and this sample was 4.5. So those are good indicators. And then if we look at a couple lines down, if you go crude protein, ammonia, and then ammonia nitrogen as a percent of the total nitrogen. Again, our goal would be probably below 12 to 15%. This is at 7%. So again, this tells us, it doesn't tell us necessarily anything about animal performance, nothing we can use to balance a ration, but it does tell us gives us some confidence that we had a good fermentation, and that certainly we don't have a big concerns, flags being raised from that clostridial fermentation, botulism, listeriosis standpoint. This is some more work they did surveying baleage quality by forage type. So look at small grains, grasses, summer annuals, legumes, and legume grasses. And I want you to take a look at that column that says MC, or moisture content. And you remember what we said our desirable moisture range. We wanted somewhere in that 50, 55%, so with a range of 45 to up in that 60. And if you look there, there's a number of those products that were made outside of that range. We've got a grass here at 50%, and a legume at 50%. And so there, again, moisture content really determines a lot about quality. And here we are outside of some of the desirable range. That 70 could be a potential flag for Clostridial fermentation, depending, and especially it's a small grain. But then we look over here at lactic acid content. It's above 3. There's our grass at low, so that's tells me that's not really good. Probably tells me my pH is going to be above 5 if I have a low lactic acid. If I look over that pH, that's for sure. I look at my summer annual here, and again made at a higher moisture content, and again my pH is a little bit on the high side. And there's my legume. So remember, we said as we got into that 50%, and especially we probably wanted to see a legume made more maybe at a 45, or 60% moisture content would be better, 65. That would be one place we push that moisture content a little bit higher, because you see, again, when we remember back to that first chart, they said sugars are limiting. So here's our limiting sugar, our lactic acid content is lower. And so again, we have a corresponding higher pH. So these, it basically tells us with some of the survey work that they did that we probably need to do a better job as producers on when we're getting out there and watching our moisture contents as we make baleage, if we want to have higher quality products. They did find in their work with producers that, again, moisture was that biggest factor that determined their lactic acid production, because it allowed them to get maybe a more complete fermentation. But you can see as moisture goes up, we start driving that pH down. And again, that's really dependent upon where our lactic acid. So we'd like to see lactic acid, again, at least 3% or higher to drive that pH to below 5. So the real question is, well, how do you go about knowing, what the moisture content is out there in the windrow? How do you get a good moisture reading? Certainly there are things like, Coster ovens, testers. We can use the microwave oven. That certainly is effective. You have to take some time, but it'll give you a fairly decent reading. A lot of people are probably just using this field test. They twist the forage, or they form it into a ball and see how quickly it springs back into shape. Some people are probably better at that than others, have a better feel for that. There are some instruments out there, Agritronics here has a windrow hay moisture tester that's rated to testing between 13 to 70% moisture. So there's their price tag. But again, if you're doing this a lot, that may be a small price to pay when you're making a lot of baleage, and depending upon getting a good quality product. They've got these probe moisture testers, really to make them work though. You have to take a windrow sample, pack it into maybe like a PVC tube, something where you're going to get a densely packed forage, and then shove that probe down into that mass of compacted forage to get a good reading on this. So they used this at University of Kentucky, and they did see that that probe was fairly accurate, certainly for within the range that we need it to be. So production practices that are important here. In order to get our hay to dry down soon, remember, our goal is to drop it to that 60% moisture level as quickly as possible to reduce the amount of sugars that get burnt up. And so this, again, work down at University of Wisconsin, and you can see that as they put it into a wide swath, so the wider that swath was, the quicker they drop that moisture content. So spreading it out into a wider swath is one of our keys as we mow our forage. This is from University of Kentucky, some of Jimmy Henning's presentation at the Ohio Forage and Grassland Conference. So good practices to get good baleage. Again, cutting early to get good forage quality and higher sugar content. Tight uniform bales, getting that density. Mowing only what can be wrapped in a day, so it goes back to that timing of wrapping to get it wrapped in a timely fashion. Baling at the wet end of the moisture content range, starting at the wetter end because you're going to dry out as you continue to go forward. Better to be maybe a little bit on the wet side than on the too dry. At least 6 layers plus of plastic, and then monitoring that plastic to make sure that if any holes are quickly patched up. There's been some people that have wondered about, mower type, does a conditioner help? Do you not need a conditioner? Baler type, some of these chop cut balers, do they do a better job? The results are a little bit inconclusive on that. It would seem like, if you were chopping that up, you might be mimicking more like a chop silage product, maybe releasing some of those sugars a little bit, but it varies on that. We don't have anything conclusive on that. Rake type though, how much soil basically are you scooping up into as you rake is a factor. And then silage inoculants. Typically they work much better in a chop system than they do in baleage, but in some cases, again, particularly maybe with a legume, using a lactic acid type of inoculant to promote lactic acid formulation might be a good insurance policy. There are different types of ways of wrapping these bales. So there are inline wrappers and individual wrappers. The inline do use less plastic. They can wrap more bales per hour, but typically you have to probably be a larger livestock operation to consider using these, because when your feed out rate, you're going to want to feed probably up to maybe 2 bales at least a day to keep ahead of mold and bunk life on that. So it does require a higher feed out rate, but again, if you have more animals, that would not be an issue. Individual bales certainly work better for smaller livestock numbers, or if you've got to move that around, gives you more flexibility in moving, or if you're selling forage, that's probably the way to go. So this, individual wrappers are available, and again, could be pretty handy, give you a little more flexibility as far as storage and moving of those bales. Inline wrappers, you have to have your location set, and then you're not going to move it. You're going to feed from that location. So you've got to think about, make sure access to those bales, even during wet and muddy conditions, and thinking about, again, your feed out rate. So other recommended practices then here, forages, certainly we've had forages I've mentioned that are getting wrapped and promoted as baleage at 25 to 40% moisture. Again, our goal is in that 50, 55% range. They can be baled, but again, they're really, what you're doing is more preserving them. So we need more wraps to ensure that it's truly an anaerobic environment, that we're not going to get heating, that we're not going to get spoilage. And those bales are not going to probably have the same shelf life as a good fermented product, but again, they can work. So we add more wraps. I know, again, some of our commercial producers here in Wayne County are using at least 8 to 10 wraps on some of those types of forages. Those are if you've got a mixture of types, those would be the bales you'd feed first. And then another key here is you want to move, if you're going to wrap these bales and move them to a storage area, you want to do that within the first 12 hours after wrapping. So once that fermentation process really kicks off and gets into gear, you don't want to be moving these bales around, possibly puncturing the bales and letting oxygen in. So move them quickly. Just another little tip here, your inline rows should be run north and south just to slow some of the degradation of plastic due to ultraviolet exposure. So again, plastic is going to break down over time and with exposure to sun. And then we end up just talking a little bit about storage and feeding. So typically don't store near the woods or heavily trafficked wildlife areas. Those are, again, just situations where we get punctures into the plastic and you have to do more repair and monitoring. Make sure you're storing these bales on well-drained, smooth surfaces. Regularly checking the plastic for tears or punctures is an important part of keeping a good quality product. When you do notice a repair immediately, and not with duct tape. They do have repair tape with these plastics, so that's what you want to use. Round bales, again, stack on that flat. And if you have really high moisture, if you're at the upper end of that, if you're in that 65 or above, probably don't want to do too much stacking. That's a lot of weight. And then again, you could risk puncturing or misshaping the plastic and causing some issues there. As we feed them out, just recognize the full fermentation process. It really takes about 6 to 8 weeks. but we'll reach a stable pH in about 4 weeks. Forages that are baled at that 40 to 60% moisture with 6 wraps of plastic really should maintain their feed value for a good year, as long as that plastic integrity is maintained. But typically we'd recommend maybe feeding within 9 months. If we have that really wet baleage, so we're at that upper end of the moisture, we want to feed that within 3 months. And baleage that's really dry, so below 40% moisture, again, hopefully we've got more wraps on it, but we feed that within 6 months. And then we've talked about some chemical appraisal, but always, again, you should be using your eyes and nose to appraise as well. So do this visual appraisal. So recognize mold could be present on baleage. Some of that is just maybe due to moisture migration out toward the end of bales, but we can look at mold, and color can also be an indication of potential toxicity. So white molds can be fairly common. Generally, they're not toxic and don't cause respiratory problems. So livestock, they can consume it sometimes if it's mixed and diluted with other forage, and particularly if it's like a TMR type of ration, they're going to eat it, and it doesn't necessarily cause issues, but palatability is going to be decreased. Performance may not be as good. But definitely now, if you have molds that are green, blue, yellow, or red in color, they do indicate a problem. Baleage with any of those colors definitely can indicate that there might be an issue with mycotoxins, and so you'd want to be very careful about feeding this and get an analysis for mycotoxins done on that. As we feed baleage, remember, as it's exposed to oxygen, air is the enemy of a fermented product. Those yeast organisms become active. They begin to cause that forage to heat and spoil. So a Penn State study on baleage, that baleage density study I mentioned earlier, said that a bale was considered spoiled and unfit once that bale temperature reached a temperature of 2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than their baseline temperature. So once it begins to heat, those spoilage organisms really take off, and again, palatability decreases, and we run the risk of health issues. So we want to monitor the amount. So again, we have to be able to feed out ahead of those spoilage rates. These are just some general guidelines. You want baleage to be consumed within 2 days in winter, and probably within a day within warmer temperatures. But a little bit of that depends, again, on the quality of baleage that you have to begin with. And then finally, if you want to get both a forage and a fermentation analysis, these are some labs that do that. So Rock River Lab, and I've got the phone number and their website there. Cumberland Valley Lab will do this, and then Dairy One out of New York. So those are some places to consider getting that fermentation analysis. But again, big keys, making at the right moisture. So I've had conversations with producers who are going into baleage, and they have concerns about making quality baleage, and I stress moisture, and then at the end of the conversation they typically say, so if I mow on Tuesday, I can bale on Wednesday, right? And that they kind of missed the point. So if you're gonna guess on moisture, you take that risk of sometimes getting a good quality product and sometimes not. So moisture determination is really a key. So hopefully this presentation, I did send this over to Lee, so he's got it. He could send it out to everyone. But if you need more information or have questions or anything, I'd be glad to answer any questions that there might be out there at this point.
Right. Thank you, Rory. I think we all appreciate that very much. It's very informative.
Thank you. And again, I acknowledge, all the different people that I have learned from about baleage. So again, thank everyone for your attention this afternoon. Again, thank you, Lee, for setting this up.